The rails on Toronto's streetcar and subway lines are set farther apart than on most railroads. Why is that? Earlier this year, I did a video on differences between the Toronto streetcars and the Eglinton Crosstown LRT vehicles. There's a magic link up there, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it when you've finished watching this video. In that video, I mentioned that the streetcar and subway systems in Toronto use a unique rail gauge. That's the distance between the rails, and I promised a video on why. So, here it is. In the early days of railroading, each railroad often came up with its own track gauge. There were many different track gauges in use, which is fine if nothing ever needs to move from one railroad to another, but it's obviously a problem if a locomotive or a goods vehicle needs to move from one railroad to another that may use a different gauge. It's also a bit inefficient for manufacturing the vehicles if the manufacturer has to make the same product with a variety of rail gauges. Now, there are still different rail gauges in use all over the world, but for the most part, in each region of the world, there's one gauge that is the most widely used. In this part of the world, it's called standard gauge. The rails are 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. I say that in imperial units because that's how it was originally defined. In some parts of the world, it's been redefined as 1,435 millimeters, which is only about 1/10 of a millimeter different. There are still other rail gauges in use in other parts of the world, and there are still some other rail gauges in use here as well, but for the most part, mainline railways in North America, Western Europe, and some other parts of the world use standard gauge. So, why does Toronto use a different gauge of 4 feet 10 and 7/8 inches, or about 6 centimeters wider? Well, for that we have to go into the history of streetcars in Toronto, and that goes back to the mid-1800s. These days, we think of transit as a service provided by a municipal agency, but it wasn't always so. Toronto's first transit system was the Williams Omnibus lines, set up in 1849 by a cabinet maker and undertaker named Bert Williams. He built some horse-drawn wagons and started offering his service. It wasn't the first stagecoach type service to include Toronto, but it was the first one that was dedicated to providing transit within Toronto rather than transportation between Toronto and other points outside. His service expanded rapidly because it was very popular, but ultimately its popularity ended up being its undoing.
Some other cities had things called street railways, and a company called the Toronto Street Railway was formed in 1861. It received a 30-year franchise from the city to build and run a system of horse-drawn rail vehicles on city streets, and it was up and running in a time that would shock anyone used to the timelines for today's transit projects. In less than 4 months, they opened their first line, starting at St. Lawrence Market and running across King and up Yonge to Yorkville. Before the end of the year, they added a second line, starting on the same route from St. Lawrence Market, but turning west on Queen Street to what was then called the Lunatic Asylum at Queen and what was then called Dundas Street. Today, that's the Center for Addiction and Mental Health at Queen and Ossington Avenue. I mentioned the renaming of that section of Dundas to Ossington in my video on Dundas Street. Links in the usual places.
Back when Toronto was founded, it was called York. And while these days we assume that streets are paved, that wasn't the case back then. They were just made of dirt. So whenever it rained or snowed, they turned into mud, giving our city the nickname Muddy York. As you can imagine, muddy streets are not a great medium for wagons to travel on. So once the Toronto Street Railway laid its rails, Williams modified the wheels of his carriages so that they would fit between the rails. But this didn't last very long, because the street railway proved to be a superior technology, and in 1862, just 1 year after it started, it bought Williams out. The 30 years of the Toronto Street Railway were kind of eventful. Less than a decade in, it defaulted on its bonds and was taken over by the bondholders. It got new owners a few years later. Its service was very popular, and its network expanded greatly over the years. I've roughly drawn the extent of its network on this map. Some of the lines were single track with short double track sections to allow streetcars to pass each other, while the more busy sections were double track like today's streetcar network. Incidentally, the term street railway survives to this day down the QEW in Hamilton, where the local transit agency is called the Hamilton Street Railway, even though they got rid of their last streetcar lines in 1951. When the franchise ran out in 1891, the city ended up buying the railway's assets for about $1.5 million. But within a few months, they decided that it was better to have somebody else running the transit system after all. So they issued a new 30-year franchise to a business called the Toronto Railway Company. They sold the assets for the same price they had bought them for, and the contract entitled the city to licensing fees and a share of the railway's revenue on an ongoing basis. The railway was also required to electrify its network within 3 years. Electrification was a shiny new thing back then. It also enabled bigger and faster streetcars. Oh, and electricity didn't poop in the street. Bonus. During the Toronto Railway Company's 30-year franchise, the City of Toronto expanded greatly by annexing surrounding municipalities, and this led to a dispute. The city insisted that the railway company had to provide service in the newly annexed areas, whereas the railway company said it only had to provide service in the areas that were part of the city at the time it signed the contract. A court ended up ruling in favor of the railway company. Toward the end of the 30-year franchise, the railway company was in a certain amount of financial difficulty thanks to its owners, and with no assurance that the franchise would be extended, the owners were reluctant to invest in the railroad. But combining this and the lack of service in areas outside of the old city, the city decided to set up its own Civic railway company called Toronto Civic Railways to offer streetcar service in those other areas. And given that they planned to combine the two systems into one once the franchise ran out, it made sense to build the new railway using the same gauge, Toronto gauge, as the existing railway.
There were other transit systems in and around the area, including both street railways for local transit and radial railways connecting Toronto with places farther away. Here are some of their names. As Toronto annexed surrounding areas, it ended up inheriting part or all of some of these systems. In 1920, voters decided that the city should run all streetcar service within the city, so in 1921, when the Toronto Railway Company's franchise ran out, all of this was merged into the brand new Toronto Transportation Commission. Some of these other systems used standard gauge, so they needed to be converted to Toronto gauge. For at least one of them, the Metropolitan Street Railway, this was actually a conversion back to its original gauge, as it had initially been built to Toronto gauge, then converted to standard gauge in the late 1800s, only to be converted back to Toronto gauge when it was merged into the TTC. In 1954, in preparation for the opening of the shiny new subway line, the Toronto Transportation Commission was renamed to the name we all know today, the Toronto Transit Commission. Speaking of the subway, it uses Toronto gauge as well. This was done at least in part because the first subway car house at Davisville, seen here on the right, was not equipped to perform all maintenance tasks, so some items needed to be sent to a streetcar maintenance facility. Having the same gauge for both systems allowed parts to be loaded onto a flat car that could move from one system to the other. It also allowed some streetcar vehicles to be repurposed as maintenance vehicles for the subway. When the Bloor-Danforth line opened in 1965, it included the Greenwood Yard and Shops, which could handle all work on subway vehicles, but by this time the subway was well established using Toronto gauge. Incidentally, I mentioned Greenwood Yard in my video on landfills in Toronto. You know where to find the links.
So how did Toronto gauge come to be that specific size instead of some other size? There are two competing explanations, and unfortunately, none of the people who made that decision back in 1861 got back to me. The first explanation is that by making it a non-standard size, that eliminated the possibility that mainline railways might insist on being allowed to run their trains on the streetcar tracks. That would of course be a problem for streetcar service, but it would also be expensive for the streetcar company, because mainline trains are much heavier than horse-drawn streetcars, so they would have to make the tracks much more robust. The problem with that explanation is there doesn't seem to be any documentation to support it until decades after the tracks had already been installed. The other possible explanation has to do with the contract for the 1861 streetcar franchise, which specified that the street railway must allow non-rail vehicles to use their tracks to the extent that it didn't interfere with streetcar operation. The solution to that is called stepped rail. It's shaped kind of like an L. The streetcar rides on the top part, while wheeled vehicles can ride on the lower part. Standard gauge was chosen at least in part because it's approximately the distance between the wheels on typical goods vans. But if you tried running that on these rails, they'll be having trouble because they would be about the same size as this. But if you make the rails farther apart, then regular wagons can run on this part of the rail, away from where the mud is, and the streetcars can run on the top part. At the time, this whole street railway thing was kind of new, so there were no established standards that had to be adhered to. You could just pick whatever gauge you wanted. And that's where Toronto gauge came from. In my earlier video, I mentioned that the now defunct Scarborough RT was a standard gauge line for the same reason why the Eglinton Crosstown is a standard gauge line, because the vehicles for both were intended to be sold in markets outside of just Toronto. But there's more to that story. When the Scarborough RT was initially designed, it was designed to use streetcars, so it was going to be a Toronto gauge line. However, the provincial government owned a company called the Urban Transportation Development Corporation, or UTDC, which had a new product line called the Intermediate Capacity Transit System, or ICTS. And they were looking for a system to be the showcase for their new product. Since the provincial government, which owned them, was providing the lion's share of the funding for the Scarborough RT, they insisted that the city build the new line using ICTS vehicles rather than streetcars, or else the province would take their pile of money and go home. So what was supposed to have been a Toronto gauge line turned into a standard gauge line. Which brings me to this elevated loop behind me at Kennedy Station. Because the line was originally designed for streetcars, and Toronto streetcars are unidirectional, they needed a loop to turn around at the end. So they would come in on one track, discharge their passengers to a platform on one side, go around the loop, come back into the station on the other track, and pick up passengers from the other platform. UTDC insisted that the ICTS vehicles could fit in this loop, which was designed for the tight curves of the Toronto streetcar system. And in practice, that was fine for 1 or 2 vehicle trains, but it couldn't handle a 4-car train. It was just too tight for that. So, because the ICTS vehicles are bidirectional, just a few years after Kennedy Station opened, it was rebuilt to have a single track with platforms on both sides, what's known as the Spanish solution, allowing passengers to be discharged from one side and picked up from the other side at the same time. And there you have it, a history of Toronto gauge and the Toronto streetcar system. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.